Welcome to another episode of Design, Develop, Share. My name is David Anderson, and this is my channel. Today, we're going to talk about sprint planning meetings and their effectiveness. And I just got finished with the sprint planning meeting with a team of about 5. And this team has 2 brand new people on that team, 2 senior level people on that team that have been with our company for a long time. And the two new people are brand new product owner, brand new QA tester. And I want to talk about a few common problems that Scrum teams have and why they're not effective in sprint planning meetings. So number one is new staff always creates problems in Scrum teams. When you have half the team that has all the knowledge and the other half the team has almost no knowledge, even with the best training, best mentorship and everything, unfortunately, the sprint planning meeting ends up just being completely one-sided. And what often happens is the senior or even one senior level person ends up driving the entire thing. Some of the other senior level people end up being passive, and the new people are very much so passive because they just don't really have much to contribute. And you could have an onboarding plan, you could have training material, you can have training videos, but let's break this down. So number one, brand new product owner, problem number one. They don't have the product knowledge, the experience, the engagement with customers and stakeholders to make smart decisions. And the problem with that is teams rely on the product owner to have confidence, decisiveness, both in my experience with developers, a deep technical understanding that the developers respect because they need to be able to talk with the development team and communicate at that level and understand the impact of what they're asking the development team to do. They also need to be a very respectful product owner, because if they're too pushy, the development team is going to push right back, and basically they'll put a wall up and the product owner is the enemy, and you don't want that. You want good collaboration. So when you have a brand new product owner, they don't have any of that day one. And even if they do have some of that, they don't have it for your company. And that's a big problem, or your product. And it's very, very interesting. So myself, am basically the tech lead I run the whole department. I'm also the product owner. Now I'm having to be the scrum master. And it poses a very interesting challenge. But what I've observed today is a brand new product owner. They're just not capable of even engaging the team, asking the right questions. They don't know the history of the product, which can make it very challenging for them to know, is it working by design? Is it a new feature? Is it a bug? What kind of decision-making process does that product owner go through to develop resolutions? Right there on the spot in the planning meeting, because if the new product owner is incapable of doing those things, which they're not going to be able to do for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, the problem is the team is not going to be successful in their sprints. So you need somebody there that can do that. So the solution to that problem is to make sure that you have somebody, an existing product owner, a senior level person, preferably not just a developer. If you happen to have a developer who can think both like a business person and developer and keep those two concepts separate and not be biased in any which way, which is almost impossible to find, but you need a senior level person on that team. And the best solution you can have is to have someone like that who can coach and train and guide the new product owner. And so for me, being on that team as their scrum master, I'm coaching them and guiding them through the whole sprint planning meeting, but I'm also posing questions to the product owner and putting them on the spot. How would you approach this? What would your answer be? Where's your head? What are you thinking? And giving them that opportunity to do that on their own while correcting things that aren't quite right, or coaching them and putting them in the right direction. So that's a big problem on an ineffective Scrum team. Whether it's a new product owner, a new QA person is almost parallel to a new product owner, so I'm not even going to go into that. Same thing, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, doesn't know the user base, can't contribute to estimates or discussion that the team needs to estimate things accurately. So That's one problem. Experience, knowledge, expertise, all those different factors are big problems, especially the decision making. Another problem that I find is a lot of teams have lack of engagement. And what I just talked about is one of those reasons why team members just don't engage. And what I've seen is commonly some team members won't engage because they just want to rely on the senior level team members for the answers, whether it's the answer for the estimate or the answer for how the system does work today or how it should work. And if they're a junior level person or a new person, like I said, that's kind of expected. But I've seen it with senior level people too. They fall into place and they just want someone else on the team to have that control. So without that engagement though, what happens is the senior level person that is providing that, eventually they get burned out. And it creates discontent within the team because that senior level person is like, you know what? Nobody contributes. Nobody even cares to try and problem solve. I'm doing all the work, and it creates a lot of discontent in the team. And then you start having conflict and interpersonal issues, and eventually it just becomes a low performing team because you have one person doing a bulk of the work. Another problem I see in scrum teams and planning meetings is ineffective estimation. Developers are notorious for estimating the worst case scenario. I think it's this. I think it's going to take 2 hours, but it could be 8. And so I'm going to go with 8. And a lot of developers will also be like, well, if it could go to 8, I'm going to double that to give myself padding so I don't fail, and it's going to go to 16. Well, problem is you can't run a business that way. If the scrum team cannot produce and accurately forecast, you have a team that just can't get things done. Now, you can make the argument that, well, if the team gets it done in a short amount of time anyway, what does that hurt? Well, the forecasting. Business people, stakeholders, outside people can't rely on when product will be delivered, when end users will get that product, which ultimately means how often are we able to ship value? How do people outside the development team plan releases, plan the backlog, plan new projects? How do you get resources involved if you literally have to do everything on a day-by-day basis because the developers aren't estimating accurately? So what I train teams to do is estimate the most likely while considering risk, uncertainty, and complexity, and what you know. But those factors that they should consider are part of the most likely outcome. I'm not going to say this worst case scenario could happen over here, and here's the risk and all the uncertainty and complexity for that. I'm going to say, here's what I want to do. Here's what I think I can do. This is very likely that this will happen. There is risk even in that. There's complexity, but that's what my estimate's based on. So typically an 8 story point item is very large to me. It's a lot of work, whereas a 1 is usually like a cosmetic change or something like that. Usually I can turn those 8s into like a 2 or 4 and actually be accurate in my estimation. Now, it's not always the case. You're going to screw up. You are going to get your estimates wrong, but you can't estimate that way all the time. So the other thing that I train teams to do is to establish a baseline framework for how to estimate. And no team member on the team will estimate the same way, but everybody needs a framework for how they estimate. What questions would I ask as a tester? What questions should I ask as a developer? Should I be thinking about code? Should I look at code in the planning meeting? Should I ask the product owner certain questions? I train people to establish a framework for how they should estimate. So the other thing I do is eventually we stress that to have a good planning meeting, you have to have good estimates. So having experienced people, having good engagement, having good estimates are all key to having a really successful planning meeting. Another thing that prevents teams from having a successful planning meeting actually is their unwillingness to break down tasks. So I have a user story or a feature that the business has ranked that I'm going to pull from the backlog, and maybe it's a fairly significantly sized project. So in some cases I'm like, well, that's 50 story points. Okay, well, that's large. To me, my capacity with my current team, which is not the same team, is 50 story points for 2 weeks. So that's It could be $30,000 when you really break it down. Those sprints cost a lot of money. So the other thing about that is if you estimate large and you don't break it down, your estimate's more likely inaccurate. The other thing that you can't do is you can't then take that story and assign pieces of work to other members of the team very easily, because it's one work item, which goes into how people track their work logs. If everyone's tracking it all on one ticket, or people don't know what they can work on without stepping on the toes of another, tasks help with that. So if you can take a 50 story point item and break it down into tasks, I need to go modify the stored procedure to do this. I need to create a new data structure in the database to store this XYZ data. We need to modify the page and create a user interface. We need to create a user interface mockup. We need to regression test these 3 areas of the system. By breaking down that large story, you create a situation where each member of the team can pull a task. You can create parallel development during the sprint, which means things get done faster, because now you're able to have multiple people doing different parts of that project concurrently, which we all know concurrency is key in computing. It's no different in software development or project management. So teams that don't break work down, probably less effective. Now, there are times where stories are too small to break down effectively. The story essentially is a task, but it's also a story, right? As a user, I would like to see a red label instead of a blue label as a user story, but it's like 2 minutes worth of work, maybe 15 by the time you check in your code, deploy it to the build server, deploy to an environment, get QA to look at it, get product ownership, acceptance out of there. But it's a 1 story point task. It takes about 20 minutes worth of work. And by the way, don't correlate story points to productivity. They're not hourly estimates. So breaking down tasks is a big problem why teams are ineffective. Teams that don't break down tasks don't have accurate or reliable burn downs. They don't know their velocity. They don't know their capacity. And they struggle often with large features because they don't know how to design systems in a way where multiple people can work on them to get a desired outcome. Usually people that don't break down tasks are used to doing work completely on their own, and usually their quality of work is not great. Very rarely you'll get a developer who's a rock star and can do that on their own, but you'll find oftentimes that those rock stars still break tasks down even for themselves. So breaking down tasks down, extremely important for an effective sprint planning meeting and day one. If you don't do it in the sprint planning meeting, then your sprint is already kind of set up for failure. Now I do train teams that they can still utilize their sprint backlog and break down additional tasks during the sprint, or even delete tasks that are no longer relevant, oftentimes by the which we'll keep around because we track work logs and effort spent on these projects. But breaking down tasks is really key. Tasks also give, along with the outside burn down, an effective view inside the team. So one work item that remains open and in progress for a 2-week sprint is not a great indication of progress or delivered value, because until that work item leaves the team and gets delivered to customers, it means nothing. So tasks, I can actually visualize how far along the story's done, the value of the work that the development team has completed, and I can project as an outsider, stakeholder, or CEO or whatever, the remaining risk, the remaining complexity, the remaining effort, and ultimately I can make very smart decisions on whether that team is going to deliver or appears to be able to deliver that value or not. Another thing that makes an ineffective sprint planning meeting is teams not accounting for anomalies, vacation time, planned, unplanned, outside risk, interruptions for the next few weeks during your sprint that you might know are going to occur. Anomalies like how much effort is going to be required for a sprint. For example, if one sprint I have a pretty even balance of development and testing work, and I've got 2 developers and a QA, great, that's a fairly balanced sprint. But if you have a sprint where, 99% of the work was dev, it's all infrastructure, it's all code, it's not any way testable, from a QA person, and the remaining pieces to test are 20 minutes worth of work for a feature, teams often will estimate wrong because they don't realize that when you share that story point as a team, they don't give that story point value any consideration of how weighted one area of the development is. And it's not something that happens a lot, but it does come up. And that goes back to establishing your baseline for estimation, how you estimate. But part of that needs to be what I call considering your estimation framework is constant, but it must consider non-constant factors. So definitely a big difference there. So all these things combined can make a very ineffective planning meeting. A couple other things we do. Product owner needs to be prepared. Backlog needs to be ranked. Product owner should have context and understanding of every single one of those. Any remaining questions that might have to be posed to the team, they should know those and be prepared to ask those and have a discussion on them with the team. They should also be prepared to have to unrank items during the planning meeting if it turns out it can't be solved in that discussion. There's too much unknown for the team to even take it on. The product owner needs to have that backlog ranked and ready. The product owner also needs to provide a goal. So what we do is before we do anything in the sprint planning meeting, we bring the business objective. This next sprint, the business really needs to accomplish stabilizing our next release. We have a deadline at such and such date, which unfortunately we must embrace the suck because that leaves us only 2 weeks. So we're going to do 2-week sprint. The product owner doesn't necessarily dictate the length of the sprint, but there are some cases where it's just a need of the business. But the product owner should always bring a goal. They should always bring the reason behind that goal, any context that our discussion or readiness they need to provide back to the development team for that goal. So the development team knows what the hell they're going to be doing. The other thing that they need to do is then sit down and be quiet and let the team then pull from the backlog and ask questions, break down their tasks. They shouldn't interfere in that at all. But they should pose questions to the team that are relevant to the product ownership aspect. So making sure the product owner is very, very prepared is extremely important, along with all these other things. So anyway, there's all kinds of things that come up in ineffective sprint planning meetings, but it is probably one of the most important meetings for successful sprints, keeping in mind that sprints are very successful and failed sprints suck because that means you carry over work, which means your next sprint is going to automatically suck, and it just creates problems. So usually I'm successful in getting teams and completing sprints, getting estimates accurate, all these things. One thing I do find though is that without a scrum master and without all those experienced people all contributing, the success of the sprint degrades over time. I found that teams are not capable, at least in my experience, unless you have a really good team, of maintaining an awesome, reliable Scrum framework for a long period of time. It usually always deteriorates. So something to keep in mind if your executives don't want to pay for Scrum Master position, that's okay. Find somebody who really loves Scrum and who really loves making teams successful. Even if they're a member of that team, take on that Scrum Master role. In my case, I'm part of 2 teams, as a Scrum Master, as a product owner, and on one team even as a developer. So my time is very, very spread thin, but it provides so much success to these teams at the end of the day. So anyway, with all that said, that's my little rant and rave for the day. Again, thank you for watching. If you like the video and the content, give me a thumbs up and definitely subscribe, and we'll see you next time.